Hello and welcome to the latest of our election podcast. This is Annabelle Dixon, political editor of the Eastern Daily Press. I've got with me Martin George, who is our education correspondent, and Chris Hanretty from the University of East Anglia, who's been playing quite a role in this campaign with his polls that have been avidly viewed across both locally and across the country. So I thought we'd start. It's Manifesto Week. Chris, what have you made of the manifestos so far?
Well, I have to confess one thing straight off the bat, which is that I haven't read all of them line by line yet. I suspect that only a tiny number of people will actually do that. And there's always a danger with this kind of thing that the people who are really involved in reading the manifestos get very carried away and fail to realise that for most people this is 30 seconds in the evening news bulletin that they barely catch. So it's certainly been interesting for me to read them, and I've been struck by a couple of things. I think that these are on the whole very professional manifestos, and if you think about UKIP's manifesto today, they've not just got the manifesto, they've got an extra costing by CEBR, which is an economics consultancy, which sets out all the numbers. So really interesting to see these 80-page, in the case of the Lib Dems, was 140-page doormats. But although it's interesting for me, I realise it's not going to be that way for everyone.
Martin, has there been anything that's particularly caught your eye in the manifestos?
I think the thing that struck me and lots of people has been this weird role reversal between the Tories and Labour. So with the Labour putting very much at the front the idea of financial responsibility and getting rid of the deficit, and the Conservatives putting a big retail offer out there with housing associations, with extra money for the NHS. I think the thing that will be really interesting is what role these manifestos play after the election, when they go to coalition agreements, assuming that's the world we're in. Which of those manifesto promises will be red lines, which ones won't be? And I think the party's been very hesitant to actually say that up front. And I think they're going to have questions for 3 more weeks about, is that a red line? Is that a red line? Are you flexible on that? So I think expect a lot of that discussion over the next 3 weeks.
Yeah, absolutely. And as someone who studies the polls closely, is there going to be a break of this deadlock in the polls?
Well, at the moment we say that there's something like an 8 or 9% chance of single party majority. So a single party getting to 323 seats. You can play around at the margins, you can have fun games where the Sinn Féin MPs don't turn up, some where they do turn up. But I think that the key takeaway is there's not going to be a huge breakthrough, and we're unlikely to get a single party majority. So that hopefully all the people who are listening to this podcast realise that by now. I think what's even more interesting is we might be in a situation where no two parties combined can put together a majority. That's to say neither the Conservatives plus the Lib Dems nor Labour plus the SNP. So if we're in that world, this whole issue of red lines won't be just a bilateral negotiation, it might be tri- or multilateral negotiation between the parties. So there'll be lots of people running around sending little negotiating parties to other party HQs and asking, okay, well, what did you really mean when you said you wanted this?
Yeah. I think one thing I'm interested in is whether the fact that when voters wake up to the idea that there probably won't be a single majority party, does that affect the way they vote? So would a Conservative voter in a constituency where perhaps they'd usually vote tactically to stop Labour getting out, well, they think, actually, I'll vote Conservative because the party with the most votes will have more legitimacy to form the government? And whether there are these sort of second-order voter judgments going on in all these constituencies, which will make it even more impossible to predict what on earth's going to happen on May the 7th.
But having had a coalition, I suppose 5 years ago we were told there was going to be markets, chaos if there was a coalition. Does that message get through, Chris?
The message of
message of vote UKIP, get Labour, vote Green.
To some extent, yes. I mean, if you look at the polls for, let's say, UKIP and the Greens, UKIP have been squeezed since probably about November or December of last year. They've dropped from about, let's say, 17% to about 13% now. Same with the Greens. Their surge happened later, but they too have been slipping probably just over the past 8 weeks. So maybe, as we come into the campaign, as people start thinking, okay, who's going to be Prime Minister, they think, okay, my vote might affect that, and the only way it's going to affect that might be through voting for Labour and Conservatives. That's one interpretation of the poll movement that we've seen.
Mm. And Martin, you're obviously right about local issues, particularly education, which is obviously a big issue on this patch. Do you think that local issues are going to play a role in this election when you've got this sort of deadlock at national level?
Well, I mean, when I studied politics at A-level, I was always told that in a constituency, the local issues are worth 500 votes at most. That was 20 years ago. I get the impression that that's changed and it's probably a lot more important. Whether there are those local issues here that will swing the needle either way, I'm not sure. For example, Norwich South, a highly marginal seat, probably number one on Labour's target list, and a really big issue there with the Hewitt School, whether it becomes an academy or not. But I think because the parties that are most likely to win the seat all agree with each other that actually we don't want it to become an academy, it probably won't be a big election issue. Norwich North, Sewell Park College, will that become an academy? Actually, that's a Tory-Labour fight. Maybe that one could become a local issue. But then again, there are facts there why both sides might not want to because of either what the county council has done, which is Labour-run, or what the Conservatives are or aren't promising so far. So I'm not sure.
Chris, you've got over 600 seats that you're monitoring, so clearly your polls aren't, the national polls aren't going to take into account what's happening locally. So do you sort of discount this view that local politics could play a role?
No, I mean, I think that the story that local issues counted for a handful of votes, that story is 20 years old, and I think that impression is right. Local issues, local campaigns do matter more. We have some constituency polls that can help us identify that. It is often difficult to say, well, it's this issue in this constituency, it's education here, it's health here. And sometimes actually, instead of issues being already there, waiting to be seized by the candidates, it's active candidates who make things issues and pick up on what's happening in the schools and turn it into something. So I think it's absolutely true that local campaigns matter more now than they ever have done in the past.
And what can we learn from previous years of polling? You've obviously, I think from what I understand, your modelling takes into account, you've looked at what's happened in the past and that's helped you formulate what you do now. How accurate have previous polls been?
Well, on the whole, they're okay. There was a bit of a blip in 1992 where the polls overestimated the swing towards Labour, and Labour underperformed relative to those polls. That was the polling industry's nightmare scenario, and they'll be hoping to avoid that now. If anything, there's a trend for polling companies to exaggerate change since the last election slightly. So one of the things which links back to the squeeze of the minor parties that I said before, earlier in the year polls were showing big swings towards the Greens, big swings towards UKIP, and that's faded away now. And we might expect that the performance of some parties which look to be surging actually disappoints compared to what the polls say. But the polls are a huge part of our model, and I love them, so I don't want to get too down on them.
Yeah, Martin, what do you think? You've got a feeling on the ground of a particular patch. What's your feeling about how polls reflecting reality?
It's really hard to know, and of course the trouble is that the polls only predict what would happen on this day, and we'll never know whether that's right or not because the election won't happen until 3 weeks' time. I think the Lord Ashcroft has done polls in some marginal constituencies, and I think they have an impact. So, for example, Norwich North, it showed most recently that the Labour candidate there might have a 1% lead over the Conservative candidate. Now, whether that's right or wrong, I don't know, but I think that'll change the campaign on the ground. We've seen a lot more high-profile Conservative women candidates, for example, flooding in there on Easter Monday, I think, and I'm sure that would have motivated the Labour troops to really go all out on the doorsteps. So whether the polls are right or wrong, I think they have an effect, and I think they can actually change things even when they're trying to measure things. If you see what I mean.
Yeah, absolutely. And certainly there was an anecdote, Jessica Rosati said she toasted a Tory peer for the first time ever because after Lord Ashcroft put her ahead of the poll. And you're right, that I've certainly felt there was certainly a change of mood in Norwich North after that happened. And I was told that in Ipswich, in Ben Gummer's seat, the poll that put him behind, he said, "Great, I can actually go out and rally my activists because this is something I can show them and say that look where we are. We need to keep going."
So he's trying to make lemonade, having been given some polling lemons.
Yeah, absolutely. So how nervous will you be on election night, given that you've sort of very put your heart out there on or your statistics out there?
I mean, I'm in the worst possible world because I get anxious every night before the model updates, but I'm not in a position to change anything about it because the model was fixed back in autumn of last year, so we know the principles behind it. We update it every day when new data comes in, but the machinery stays the same. So I'm going to be really anxious and stuck with that. So it's not an enviable position to be in. But I do believe in the model, I believe in the forecasts, and hopefully we'll be skilled enough to get close to the outcome and lucky enough that we come closer still.
Well, on that note, we'll leave it there. Thank you very much, Chris and Martin, for
Thank
joining
you.
us today, and join us for our next podcast soon.